right, let's go back to what we have studied previously about Ruth. We looked at chapters 1 and 2 last time, and we're ready for 3 and 4, and that winds this up, and then we are ready for 1 Samuel. And we will put 1 Chronicles with that and put those books in. Chronicles is never studied by itself. In this survey, we work it in where it fits in parallel, and so that's what you'll see reflected in your questions. Just a little review of our introductory information about the purpose of the book. It seems to be to trace the lineage from Perez, Judah's son, to David through Boaz and Obed. And we see that at the end of this chapter we're studying tonight in chapter 4. The time period, as chapter 1 reflects, we went over this last week. Chapter 1 and verse 1 mentions the judges. It's in the period of the judges. The end of the book of Judges, as we have mentioned numerous times, is not sequential, meaning that it just follows in a continual sequence, but was descriptive of the time period of the Judges, and so this fits into that period. I don't think it fits directly following the book of Judges, and we gave that the speculation with reference to that last time. We don't know the author. It's one of 2 books that is named after a woman, Esther being the other, which is a Jew married to a Gentile, and this is a Gentile being married to a Jew. The Moabites that we mentioned here, Ruth was a Moabite. She is a descendant of Lot, Genesis chapter 19. And this is a love story, but it begins with a funeral and ends with a wedding, as we're going to see in chapter 4. Now, Moab, as we mentioned last time, is here close to the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. That's the location of that, and that's where the story begins. With them taking off to Moab. Now, this is our last time to look at this outline, a bar from Wiersbe, and I like some of his outlines, not all of them, but some of his outlines I like. And I like this one on Ruth. Ruth's sorrow, chapter 1, Ruth's service, chapter 2, Ruth's surrender, chapter 3, and then Ruth's satisfaction, chapter 4. And move on to chapter 3, as he calls it, Ruth's surrender. We're going to see she obeys Naomi, and she submits to Boaz, and she waits for Boaz to work. So she is surrendering as he words it. Sometimes he stretches his words a little bit in their meaning to make his outlines agree, as he often does. Chapter 4, Ruth's satisfaction, Boaz redemption, redeems Ruth, and then Boaz marries Ruth, and then Boaz and Ruth have a son. All right, let's go to chapter 3 now. Question number 1 for tonight. A summary of chapter 3. What is chapter 3 about? All right, Ruth seeks redemption from Boaz. Question number 2. Let's go and get a summary of chapter 4. What's chapter 4 about? Ruth marries Boaz. All right, let's go back to chapter 1. We've reviewed as per Wiersbe's outline. As we looked at chapter 1, it was the story of they had gone to Moab, and they stay in Moab. Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons went to Moab. And why did they go to Moab? Because of famine in the land, and because they're seeking bread. And so they go there, and who dies? How many people die in the first part of the story? 3. Elimelech and 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, both die. And they both had married. And so now we have Naomi, the wife, is left with her daughters-in-law. What happens in chapter 1 now? Some time passes. Ruth made the dedication to go. Now I want to go back to chapter, and one reason I want to go back and review just to remember, but I also wanted to go back to verse 15, 16, 17, and 18. And this is the commitment that Ruth made. What did Ruth say? I don't mean the direct quote, but what did she say in essence? Someone summarize. That I'm not going to go back to my people, but I'm going to go with you. And then what kind of commitment did she make? Very good. Yes. Your people be my people. In other words, I'm going to identify with you, and I'll be in your family. Your family will be my family, and your God will be my God. I take it from that though she came from those who would serve idols and gods, plural, she's going to commit herself to serve the true living God that she has learned about through Naomi and Elimelech and her sons. And so your God will be my God. She's committed to go back and serve that God. Now, what happened in chapter 2 last week? She showed herself to be a working woman. Yes, she goes and works in the field of Boaz, and she gathers behind, that is what's left over for the poor. She does that. Then what happens? When Boaz notices that, yes, work only in his fields, and that she does, and then leaves some, deliberately drops some along the way so that there is plenty. And she goes back and she tells Naomi about that. All right, now let's go to chapter 3. It's already been mentioned. Chapter 3 now simply deals with Ruth seeks redemption from Boaz. Now, two principles are involved in these two chapters concerning Old Testament law and what is required of the Israelites when two things take place, and these are two different circumstances that are meshed together in this context. One was the principle of redemption, and the other was the Levirate law having to do with if a man dies. Now let's go first of all to the matter of redemption. And so let's go to Leviticus chapter 25 just for a moment. The principle of redemption, like the redemption of property. Leviticus 25 beginning at verse 23 down through verse 34, and that the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. That's the reason given, because it belongs to God. And for you are strangers and sojourners with me. In other words, I'm giving this land to the children of Israel, and when I give it to you, then when you sell it, it's not sold permanently. So what is it? What's the point? Well, look at verse 24. In all your land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. If one of your brothers becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, his near kinsman redeemer, notice that phrase, the kinsman redeemer comes to redeem it. And then he may redeem what his brother has sold. So one, because he becomes poor, sells his property to someone else. Then the nearest of kin had a responsibility and the right to come and to redeem that and buy that back. It's not permanently gone. Then at verse 26, if a man has no one to redeem it, he himself may be able to redeem it. In other words, he could buy it back later. And then let him count the number of years since it was sold and restore the balance of it, because then there's the year of Jubilee, which we won't go into. You remember the year of Jubilee, that it is released from the debt. Now, I won't go back through all the way through verse 34, but that was the law and the principle that comes to play here. As we have the land that Naomi and Elimelech has sold at some point, and we'll talk about when that may have been in a moment, that's going to come to play here. That law and that principle. Let's go to another passage in Deuteronomy 25 now. And in verse 5. And here's another law. And this had to do with what is referred to as the Levirate or marriage law, concerning the duty of if one died, then the brother was to bring, if a man died, then his brother was to take his widow and it becomes his wife, and he raises up seed for his brother and in his brother's name. So we won't read all the details of this, but notice at verse 5, if a brother dwells with another and he dies, and the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. The husband's brother shall take her and she becomes his wife. And it shall be that the firstborn, which succeeds to the name of the dead brother, he carries the name of his brother, so it's actually his descendants. Now, at verse 7, if he doesn't want to take the brother's wife, then let the brother's wife go to the gate of the elders, And the man, if he refuses to raise up seed into his brother's name, dropping down to verse 8, then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him, and if he stands firm and says, I will not take her, then the brother's wife shall come in his presence of the elders and remove his sandals from his feet and spit in his face and say, so shall it be done to the man with whom who will not build up his brother's house. Well, that's important because that comes to play in this context we're about to mention. Now look at verse 10 to finish that before we go further. And the name shall be called, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. And so that was a symbol and a sign of his rejection of his responsibility. Now with that in mind, we're going to come to those principles here as we go further. Those two laws, which were not the same law, are meshed together in this context. Now let's talk about Naomi told Ruth to go to Boaz and lie at his feet. Some practical things. If you don't have anything in answer to question 8, watch for that as we go further. Let's start with verse 1, that she suggests that Ruth seeks and needs a redeemer. Naomi, the mother-in-law, said, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you that it may be well with you? What's this word security suggest to you? All right, a rest. It is translated a resting place in the same word in Deuteronomy 28, a resting place. Genesis 8 in verse 9, it's translated a resting place. What else? Anybody have a footnote? The footnote in the New King James says rest. It can be translated security, rest, or a place of rest. So what's the point of that? What she is saying to Ruth is, I do not want you to stay completely with me and not have a husband and not have children. I want you to have security. I want you to have a home. I want you to have rest. I want you to have, and notice the term security and rest is the same word translated in different passages. But I want you to have rest and I want you to have security by having a husband and having children. Make sense? So having this family is rest. It's the same concept of resting. Having a family is security. I want you to have security. I want you to have rest. I want you to have a home is what I want you to have. Now, at verse 2 to 4, she then instructs her to go to Boaz. What does she tell her to do? This is in the spring, seemingly around April, time of the barley harvest. She tells Ruth, all right, very good. Start at verse 2. He's now harvesting, or he's winnowing the barley tonight at the threshing floor. So go put your best clothes on and make yourself more attractive than in your work clothes of out working in the field. That's the point. So go anoint yourself, wash yourself, put on a garment that makes yourself more attractive, because she's going to present herself that I need someone to redeem me, number one, and will end up marrying me. That's what I'm looking for, the nearest of kin. She is trying, at the instructions of Naomi, to follow the principles of Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25. Does that make sense? She's made the pledge in chapter 1, I'm going to follow your God. That's what she's doing, isn't it? She's following the principles of the God of Naomi. So wash yourself and go, and when the man's finished eating, then when he lies down, that is, he's sleeping out in the field. This is not at his house. He's lying out and sleeping in the field as they're harvesting their crops and spending the night out in the field is what he's doing. And so find out where he's laying down. One translation gives the idea of notice the place where he lies. In other words, take note of where he's going to lie down, and then after he's laid down, then come and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Now that seems a little odd to lay at his feet and uncover his feet. We're going to make a point about that in a moment and explain that when we get down to verse 9. We'll wait for that. But that's what she's to do. And verse 5, then her reaction was, I'll do exactly what you said. And that's what she does. All right, so she's told to go and lie at his feet. Now, Ruth laid at Boaz's feet and requested redemption. So let's get verses 6 and 7. She goes and she lays at his feet. And just as the mother-in-law had said, and when he had eaten and laid down, then at the end of the heap of grain, she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down at his feet. We'll talk about the significance of uncovering his feet, as was told at verse 4 in just a moment. Look at verse 8 and 9 together. That she requests redemption, and this is where we want to talk about what this all means. What happens when he turns and realizes there's a woman lying at his feet? This is in the middle of the night, about midnight. It startled him, number one, and asked, "Who are you?" And she explained, "I'm Ruth." And here's her request. "Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a near kinsman." That immediately tells Boaz the responsibility that's laid upon him, she thinks, and the request that is being made. Now, I want to look at a couple of passages. What she's appealing to is the two principles now of Leviticus 25, the law of redemption, and the principle of Deuteronomy 25, the Levirate law. Making sense? She's appealing to both of those. That's what she's asking for. Now let's turn to Ezekiel 18 for what it's worth to us. This seemingly is, and by the way, her coming and lying at his feet, uncovering his feet, and asking to be covered with his garment, or the footnote will literally say, spread the corner of your garment over your maidservant. This is nothing to be interpreted as sensual. This is not her going as if you could picture her going into his house and into his bed and going into his bedroom, and everything looks as if this is something sensual involved. There is no evidence of that. In fact, she's commended for not doing that kind of thing in just a moment. But Ezekiel chapter 16, this is a passage dealing with harlotry and how Israel had gone after the harlots. And God is saying, I took care of you, and yet you became an unfaithful wife. Now notice it, verse 8, Ezekiel 16 and verse 8. When I passed by you again and looked upon you, indeed, your time was the time of love. So I spread my wing over you and covered your nakedness. Similar phrase. This seemed to be a statement that talked about what one would show toward their bride or their prospective bride, of covering them with a garment. So what's the point? It's the idea of she is asking to be his wife. She's asking for redemption and asking also, since you are the nearest of kin, then I'm asking to be your wife. That's what she's asking. And so the expression at verse 9 of take your maidservant under your wing, or as the footnote, if you're reading in the New King James, spread the corner of your garment. In other words, it seems to be the picture of him having a garment, and if he even just puts the corner of the garment over her, not saying they're getting under the covers together, that's not the idea, but it's as putting the corner of the garment over her suggests this is the one that I would be married with. Making sense? Kind of a proposal or a statement of commitment toward one another. That seems to be the idea. That it's not just that you think it's strange. Why did she go to his feet? Why didn't she just go and wake him up and say, I'm your nearest of kin, why don't we get married? But this was a symbol of showing that. Make sense? Now, that's the best I can do with that, and I think that makes sense to me at least. So now Boaz promises redemption, and I want you to notice what he says to her. The first thing he says to her, he commends her for what? Verse 10 and 11. Yes. Not going, notice the wording of verse 10, you've shown more kindness in the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. Now I take that to mean this, that she is, in fact at verse 11, let's get ahead to verse 11, that all my people in my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Now this is interesting to me. That she is commended for being a virtuous woman. She came to Boaz, but there were men in the field, there were young men in the field. If she was interested in sensuality, she could have found someone younger, perhaps better looking, and gone after them looking for just a sensual and pleasurable relationship. But he commends her, she doesn't do that. But rather she's trying to follow, at the direction of Naomi, God's principles. Make sense? There's something practical in that. And that is, when we would follow God's principles and looking for who we marry, it would work better to follow the principles of God than just looking for good looks and relationships, pleasurable relationships. That makes sense? That almost preach, wouldn't it? We can almost come down hard on that and say a few things, but we'll move on. That's a good practical point to learn from that. That's what he's commending her. I think he's commending her for following this principle because she's appealing to divine law, Leviticus 25, Numbers 25, and he's commending her for following that and not going after the young men, whether they're rich or poor. And if you're interested in sensual things or interested in good looks, you don't care if they're rich or poor, you're just interested, he's good looking, she's good looking, and that's all I care about. He said, you weren't interested in that. You're interested in coming and following divine law. I think that's the point to be made. Now, what does he now tell her to do beginning at verse 13? Well, let's go back to verse 12. He says all of that, but then he says, but here's something you may not know. You have a closer relative than me. I'm not the nearest. I'm a near kin, you're right. But there's someone closer. So we need to follow through with that first. And so stay the night. And if he won't do what he's supposed to do, then I'll perform the duty. And so just lie down until the morning. Again, nothing sensual. There is nothing out of place. They're sleeping out in the open field and by the heaps of grain. Perhaps others around, though they're not mentioned, but she stays there until the morning. Now, he seems to be interested in protecting her. How? Verse 14. She got up. The word is not, it doesn't say early, but it means early. What does it say? This means she got up early. Before anybody could recognize her. All right. So it means she got up real early for daylight. And what does he say to her? You need to get on out of here. Isn't that what he says? Yeah. Evidently. Do not let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. In other words, it seems to me that he's trying to protect her reputation and his own. And so it's best. Nothing's going on that's illicit, but we don't want the reputation of that. Now here's something practical. Do everything you can to protect your reputation and the reputation of the people around you. Does that make sense? As a preacher, as an elder, or as a Christian for that matter, I never meet with a woman close to my age by myself. One of the other elders is going to be there. My wife's going to be there. Somebody's going to be there. I'm never going to meet with her by myself. Why? Looks bad. Okay, could be temptation. But even if there's not temptation, and you're right, that's where a lot of men, a lot of preachers have got into trouble. But even if there's not even a temptation, it doesn't look good. And I'm protecting whose reputation? Hers and mine. Be careful. Be careful. That would preach too, I think, if we had time. Let's go to verse 15 now. 14 to 18. Let's finish this section. What does he do for her at 15, I'm sorry. He gives her grain, yes. How much does he give her? 6 ephahs of barley, and laid it on her shawl. Some translation will say her veil. This is not a veil that would just hang out like a woman would wear, but it would be something very big and very long that covered much of her body. And evidence of that is how much you could put in that. An ephah, this is from Bible Man, an ephah is equal to 10 omers, which is equivalent to 20.9 quarts. Let's just go with 20 quarts. And so you take the 20 quarts times 6 is a lot of grain that he gives her, of barley. And so she fills up this veil or this shawl and carries it back to her mother-in-law. So it's a pretty good amount she took back. Yeah. And I wondered about how she could carry that much. May have drug it, who knows. Now then, what happens when she gets back to her mother-in-law before we get to chapter 4? She comes back to her mother-in-law and she says, basically, look what he's given me. He gave me, he told me not to go home empty to your mother-in-law. And so the mother-in-law and Naomi advised what? Just wait, sit still until he has concluded the matter. And in other words, just be patient. He's going to conclude this matter within just a little while. And he's going to find out if the nearest of kin is going to be the one to redeem you, or will he do that? Let's just wait and see. Either way, she's going to be taken care of. All right, questions or comments on chapter 3 before we move to chapter 4? Question number 4, what did Boaz ask the near of kin to do? To redeem her, yes. Very good. And what did Boaz do? Verses 7 through 12. He ended up redeeming her and marrying her, did he not? According to the text. All right, here's chapter 4. Boaz redeems Ruth. And so Boaz asked the nearest of kin to redeem her and to take Ruth as a wife, and yet he wouldn't. So let's get verses 1 to 4. How did he come in contact with him? He was waiting for him. He knew who he was, and so he sits where? Sits at the gate of the city and waits for him to come by, and he said, come aside, my friend, and sit down. And so he came aside and sat down. I don't think I was just, hey, let's have a little chat, but I've got something to tell you. And what else did Boaz do? Yes, got 10 men of the city to come together, and y'all sit down and let's talk, and I want you to be witnesses of what goes on. Now, here's the story. Look at verse 3. That the near kinsman, our near kinsman, Naomi, had come back from the country of Moab and sold a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. There's some question as to when that was sold. Some think that it was sold when she came back to the land, and they take the wording of this to imply that when she came back to the land, she sold it. And yet the chapters 1 and 2 doesn't give us any indication of that. That may be the case, but if they've come back and there's bread, and then if she's just recently sold it coming back into the land, then that makes me wonder if you just recently sold it, why are you redeeming it now instead of later? It seems more likely that the land was sold when they went to Moab. That makes sense. They're out of bread. They take their money, selling their land. They're poor. That, according to Leviticus 25, is when you sold, is when you became poor. And so you need the money and you go off to Moab. That makes more sense to me, though I'm not going to press that point. That makes sense. And so he says at verse 4, I need to inform you about that, so buy back the piece, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants of the elders, and if you will redeem it, and if you will not redeem it, then tell me and I'll redeem it, and I'm the next one after you and I'll redeem it. So that's down to verse 4. Hadn't said a thing about Ruth yet. He's just saying, they need the land redeemed, and we're going to need someone to do that, and you're the nearest of kin. What's his response? Sure. Yeah, I'm interested in the land. I'm interested in the land, and I'll do that. Then Boaz said, but, on the day that you buy the field from Naomi, you're also buying from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead in inheritance. In other words, you're going to follow Deuteronomy 25 as well as Leviticus 25 is what you're going to do. That's what the nearest of kin is going to do. And what was his response? I can't do that, lest I impair or ruin my own inheritance. You redeem it, for I cannot redeem it. Now, why could he not redeem it? Let me give you some possibilities of that. And the short answer to the question of why is I don't know. That's the short answer. That's the accurate answer. I know that one's accurate. But he seems to want the land, but if he has to marry Ruth, then it may be, some have speculated, and there is conjecture here, and I recognize that, and I'll present it as conjecture. Some have speculated that it's because he would have to raise up the firstborn, as Deuteronomy 25 says, and in the name of his brother. It wouldn't be in his own name, but the name of his brother. It'd be basically his brother's seed. And so he's not interested in that. That may be. I don't know. Some have suggested that the kicker is that he already has a wife. He doesn't say that, but that's a possibility, that I could buy the land, but I can't take her as a wife. So you're going to need to do that because I can't do that. Baxter suggests that, and there's no evidence of this except some speculation, that he refuses to do it because his attitude is that these brothers went off with their parents and they married women of Moab, and they should have married women of Moab. And I'm not getting involved in that. Maybe. Barnes says that he couldn't afford it. Maybe he could afford the land, but not afford taking on a wife. I don't know. And so the bottom line, I told you, the accurate answer is I don't know. I don't know why. But he says it would ruin his inheritance. It would somehow, and perhaps the idea of raising up his brother's seed may be the problem. I don't know. Anything else you want to add to that? If I can speculate, then maybe you could too. All right. Let's look at verses 5 and 6 now. Boaz informs him, but he declined. Now that got us down through verse 6. Now verse 7 is where I want to start. 7 through 12. Boaz redeems all that belongs to Elimelech, and so he sealed it it was sealed with this removal of the sandal. But now notice at verse 7, this was the custom in former times in Israel, that concerning redeeming and exchanging, that one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and that was the ratification of their covenant. There's two things involved here, I think. One is, that does seem to be, according to verse 7, the custom that when one would make a deal, that's part of taking off the sandal and handing it to them, and as we might sign on the dotted line is as evidence that this is a sealed deal, and it has the approval and so forth, the stamp or the seal on it. But there's also something comes to play back in Deuteronomy 25. Do you remember that if the brother didn't do that, and that the wife could come to him and remove his sandal and shame him for not doing that? Remember that? And so this seems to be a case where maybe both things are involved. So let's go a little bit further. The nearest of kinsmen said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and then he took off his sandal. In other words, it's going to come off anyway. And so this is my sign of saying to you, this is the deal. I'm telling you that I'm forfeiting my right to that, and my sandal would be taken off for refusing, so I'm taking it off anyway, and so this is a sign, this is a done deal. And so buy it for yourself. So then what did Boaz do at verse 9? What did he say in verses 9 through 12? He turns to the 10 elders sitting there that he'd called together as a witness. And by the way, he called them because some deal is going to take place here before they leave, because if this man doesn't agree to it, then I'm going to agree to it, and I need witnesses, so this is a done deal. We're fixing to have a deal here on something. I need witnesses. So what does he do to turn to the elders and say? Yeah, I bought the land, I'm going to marry the woman. And so verse 10, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, I have acquired as a wife to raise up the name of the dead for the inheritance, that the name of the dead might not be cut off from among the brethren, and you're witnesses to this day. And so the deal is over. He just forfeited his right. He had the right because he's the nearest of kin. I'm the next in line, so I'll do the duty, and I will redeem the land, and I'll redeem her. Make sense? The sandal was taken off. Y'all were witness to that. And their answer to that was, verse 11, we are witnesses. It's a done deal. You've got witnesses to the fact you have married her. Now then, what did they say? They commended him. What did they say? Brought up some Old Testament names, which this is Old Testament, I recognize, but some other older Old Testament names, what I'm trying to say. He brought up Rachel and Leah. What was the point? Yes. And the wording here is, they're mothers of the tribes of Israel. But the wording here is they built up Israel. I like that phrasing, built up Israel. And this seems to be a prophecy, by the way, to me. Makes sense? And at this juncture, if we didn't know anything further, we might not think of it as a prophecy, but when we get to the end of the chapter of what came out of this marriage, this obviously seems to be a prophecy that may the Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, and the Lord will give you from this, the offspring the Lord will give you from this marriage. So they seem to be prophesying, whether that's actually prophecy or not, that seems to be a prophecy. Now let's finish the chapter and we'll go to some practical things. Let's talk about the birth of Obed. So beginning at verse 13, Boaz took her as a wife, and notice at verse 13 that he went into her and the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son. Now let's stop for a moment. Here's something practical. We often talk about providence. Providence is different from a miracle. Miracle is something supernatural. The virgin birth of Christ was a miracle, supernatural. There was nothing, because there was no man involved in that birth. But here is a natural birth. And evidence of that, without being graphic, is the text says that he took her as a wife, he went in unto her, and she bore a son. But the text also said the Lord gave her conception. See my point about providence? Providence has to do with God working through natural means. God's still working. God's in control. God could have had Ruth to have a son miraculously as a virgin, but he didn't do that. He had her to have a son naturally, but God's working in that. Make sense? That's providence. You want a good statement of providence? Verse 13 would be one. Now, at verse 14, the child is born and brings joy to Naomi. I'm going to skip that in interest of time. That's not that that's not important. But verses 18 to 20, here's the genealogy from Perez to David. So you might underline that. Two things we want to point out about that. We looked at this last time. That starting with Judah, you have Perez, same man. We're talking about the same man here. And then there's Herzon. All of these names are mentioned. And then Ram and Abinadab and Nashon and Salmon. And now we have Boaz and Obed. And Obed's the father of... who is the father of David. That's the lineage of Christ. Now, for what it's worth to us, let's jump over to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. We have a further description of the lineage starting back with Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, on down the line. Now notice right in the middle of this, Boaz is mentioned at verse 5. And Boaz begat Obed by Ruth. There's our Ruth. And Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. And then David, Solomon, and all the way down till we come to Christ. So you have the complete list in Matthew chapter 1. But we only have a partial list right here in Ruth 4. But this is the purpose of the story. Is what's going on right here in this picture. But we know the storyline behind Ruth. And what's going on there. All right, let's go to question number 9 in the minute or two we have left. And practical things that you've learned. What do you learn from chapters 3 and 4? Good point. Good point. Yeah. There's respect, not just passion. It's genuine respect. Good point. Good point.
You can see certain situations where matters were handled proper order and according to God's will.
Good point. With respect for purity and reputation. That's good. What else? Good point. Yeah, she was a Moabitess, and yet God had a place for her. Good point. Very good point. What else? Interesting point. And that's often true today. Sometimes people who you think shouldn't know much about the will of God will follow it better than those who are supposed to know. Good point. Anything else? Practical. One of the things I learned, I don't have time to go over all of these, but the ratification and binding nature of an agreement, that's powerful. And the last thing I'll mention is we've already talked about the reputation and the protection of it. Be careful of your reputation and make sure you're protecting yours and everyone else's around you in how you conduct yourself. Everybody in here next week on 1 Samuel.